There was Jimmy Page before seeing Jimi Hendrix play, and Jimmy Page after. Before, confident session ace, one of London's elite guitarists. After, someone who understood he'd only been scratching the surface. The transformation happened in less than an hour in a small London club, watching an American guitarist do things that seemed physically impossible. October 1966, the night Jimmy Page's confidence died and his education began. London, October 1966. Jimmy Page was 22 years old and already a legend in British music circles. Not as a rock star, he hadn't formed Led Zeppelin yet, but as a session guitarist. If you heard a great guitar part on a British record in the mid-1960s, there was a good chance Jimmy had played it. He'd worked with The Who, The Kinks, Them, countless others. He was the guitarist other guitarists called when they needed something special. Studio engineers knew that if Jimmy Page was on a session, they'd get the take they needed, played perfectly, usually on the first try. Jimmy was good, and he knew it. Not arrogant exactly, but confident in his abilities. He'd earned that confidence through hundreds of recording sessions, through mastering techniques that other guitarists struggled with, through being the most reliable player in London. He'd recently joined the Yardbirds, replacing original bassist Paul Samwell Smith and eventually taking over lead guitar duties from Jeff Beck. The Yardbirds were one of Britain's premier blues rock bands, innovators pushing the boundaries of what rock guitar could do. Jimmy felt like he was at the top of his game. Then, October happened. The call came from a friend, another musician on the London scene. There's this American guitarist you need to see, tonight, BagONails Club in Soho. Jimmy had heard vague mentions of Jimi Hendrix, an American guitarist who'd been brought to London by Chas Chandler, formerly of The Animals. Supposed to be good, building a following in the London clubs. But London had plenty of good American guitarists passing through. Jimmy didn't think much of it. He almost didn't go. "You have to see this," his friend insisted. "Everyone's talking about him. Clapton saw him last week and hasn't been the same since." That got Jimmy's attention. Eric Clapton was one of the few guitarists in London whose opinion Jimmy respected. If Clapton was impressed, maybe this Hendrix character was worth seeing. Jimmy arrived at the BagONails around 10 p.m. The club was small, crowded, filled with cigarette smoke and the buzz of conversation. He recognized several faces, other musicians, music journalists, people from the record labels. Word had clearly spread about this American guitarist. He found a spot near the back where he could see the stage clearly. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, that's what they were called, consisted of 3 people, Jimmy on guitar, Noel Redding on bass, and Mitch Mitchell on drums. Jimmy watched them set up, trying to gauge what kind of show this would be. Jimmy looked different from British guitarists, more flamboyant in his dress, more theatrical in his movements, even before playing a note. Jimmy, who dressed conservatively and let his playing speak for itself, found the showmanship slightly off-putting. Then Jimmy started playing. The first song was a blues number, something Jimmy recognized. Standard 12-bar structure. Nothing revolutionary about the song choice. But what Jimmy was doing with it, that was something else entirely. Jimmy leaned forward, trying to understand what he was hearing. The guitar sounded like multiple instruments playing simultaneously. Rhythm and lead blended together in ways that shouldn't be possible from one player. And the tone, aggressive, raw, but controlled. Not the clean, precise sound Jimmy cultivated in the studio, but something wilder, more dangerous. After the first song, Jimmy thought maybe he'd just been surprised by Jimmy's approach. Different didn't necessarily mean better, just different. By the third song, that rationalization was becoming harder to maintain. Jimmy was playing the guitar behind his head. Not as a gimmick. The music didn't suffer, didn't miss a beat. He was genuinely playing, creating melody and rhythm, while the guitar was positioned where he couldn't even see the fretboard. Jimmy had never seen anything like it. More importantly, he'd never conceived that it was possible. The technical skill was one thing. Jimi understood technique. He had plenty of it himself. But this was something beyond technique. This was approaching the guitar with a completely different philosophy. Where Jimi had learned to make the guitar do what he wanted, Jimi seemed to be in conversation with the instrument. Where Jimi controlled the guitar through precision, Jimi collaborated with it, including its imperfections and quirks as part of the music. Jimi watched Jimi's fingers on the fretboard between songs when the stage lights shifted. Even the way Jimi held the guitar was different, looser, more relaxed, as if the instrument was an extension of his body rather than a tool he was wielding. Jimi had always maintained perfect posture, optimal hand position, textbook technique. Jimi seemed to ignore every rule Jimi had learned about proper guitar playing, yet somehow produced sounds that were more musical, more expressive, more alive. During a slower number, Jimi used feedback deliberately, making it musical rather than just noise to be avoided. He bent strings in ways that created sounds Jimi had never heard from a guitar. He used the tremolo bar, which most guitarists avoided because it knocked the guitar out of tune, as an integral part of his musical expression. Jimi found himself analyzing every choice Jimi made, trying to deconstruct the techniques, understand the theory behind the sounds. But the more he analyzed, the more he realized this wasn't about technique that could be learned through practice. This was about approaching the guitar with a completely different philosophy. Where Jimi had learned to make the guitar do what he wanted, Jimi seemed to be in conversation with the instrument. Where Jimi controlled the guitar through precision, Jimi collaborated with it, including its imperfections and quirks as part of the music. Jimi watched Jimi's fingers on the fretboard between songs when the stage lights shifted. Even the way Jimi held the guitar was different, looser, more relaxed, as if the instrument was an extension of his body rather than a tool he was wielding. Jimi had always maintained perfect posture, optimal hand position, textbook technique. Jimi seemed to ignore every rule Jimi had learned about proper guitar playing, yet somehow produced sounds that were more musical, more expressive, more alive. It wasn't just the playing, it was the relationship Jimi had with sound itself. Jimi realized he'd been thinking about guitar in terms of notes, which notes to play, when to play them, how to execute them cleanly. Jimi seemed to think in terms of textures, colors, emotions. He wasn't playing notes, he was painting with sound. During one instrumental break, Jimi created a sound that Jimi initially couldn't identify. It wasn't a note or a chord. It was somewhere between a growl and a scream, somehow both musical and primal. Jimi mentally cataloged the technique, feedback, tremolo bar, maybe some manipulation of the volume knob, but even understanding the mechanics didn't diminish the mystery of how Jimi knew to make that exact sound at that exact moment. That was perhaps the most unsettling realization. Jimi could probably learn to replicate any individual technique Jimi used. He had the skill, the dedication, the musical knowledge, but he couldn't learn when to use them, how to combine them, what emotional truth they were meant to express. That came from somewhere Jimi couldn't access through practice or study. Halfway through the set, Jimi noticed his hands were clenched. He relaxed them consciously, but they tensed up again within minutes. He was physically reacting to what he was hearing, his body recognizing something his mind was still trying to process. Near the end of the set, Jimi played Hey Joe, a song Jimi knew, had even considered recording with the Yardbirds. Hearing Jimi's version made Jimi grateful they hadn't recorded it. Anything the Yardbirds would have done with the song would have sounded timid compared to this. The set ended. The crowd erupted. Jimi stood still, unable to move, barely able to process what he'd just witnessed. Someone tapped his shoulder. It was Jeff Beck, the Yardbirds' other guitarist. Jeff's face was pale. "Did you see that?" Jeff asked. Jimi nodded, unable to form words yet. "We're fucked," Jeff said flatly. "All of us. Every guitarist in London. We're all fucked." Jeff walked away.
Jimi stayed where he was, watching people crowd around the stage, trying to talk to Jimi, get his attention. Jimmy's mind was racing through implications. He'd spent years mastering the guitar, thousands of hours of practice, hundreds of recording sessions. He'd become one of the most sought-after guitarists in Britain through dedication, discipline, and continuous improvement of his technique. And in 90 minutes, he'd watched someone demonstrate that everything he'd mastered was just the beginning. That there was an entirely different level of guitar playing he hadn't even known existed. It wasn't that Jimi was better in a technical sense, though his technique was extraordinary. It was that Jimi was playing a different instrument. The guitar in Jimi's hands and the guitar in Jimi's hands were theoretically the same object, but they might as well have been different species of tool. Jimi left the club without trying to meet Jimi. He wasn't ready for that conversation. What would he even say? "Hello, I'm one of London's top session guitarists, and you just made me feel like I learned the guitar from a children's book." He walked home in silence. It was a long walk. He needed the time to think. His friend tried to engage him in conversation about the show, but Jimi could barely respond. His mind was elsewhere. The streets of London felt different somehow, or maybe Jimi felt different moving through them. Every guitar he'd played, every session he'd dominated, every compliment he'd received, they all seemed to exist in a different context now. Not worthless, but incomplete, like he'd been playing checkers while believing it was chess, and Jimi had just shown him what chess actually looked like.
He thought about the other guitarists in that club, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, himself, the holy trinity of British guitar. They'd all been operating under the assumption that they were exploring the furthest reaches of what the instrument could do. Tonight proved they'd been working in a small room, convinced it was a mansion, unaware of the cathedral that existed beyond walls they hadn't known were there. What bothered Jimi most wasn't that Jimi was better. Better implied they were on the same scale, just at different points. This wasn't about better. This was about different dimensions entirely. Jimi had been measuring his progress in miles. Jimi had revealed the existence of flight. By the time he reached his flat, Jimi had moved through several emotional stages. Initial shock, then defensive rationalization. Maybe Jimi's style wouldn't work in a studio setting. Maybe it was just showmanship without substance. Then anger at himself for being satisfied with his abilities when clearly there was so much more to learn. Then something like grief for the guitarist he'd been just a few hours ago, who'd thought he understood the instrument. Finally, as he sat in his flat with a cup of tea he didn't drink, he reached something like acceptance. Actually, not acceptance, determination. Jimi Hendrix had shown Jimi that the ceiling he'd thought existed, the limit of what a guitarist could do, was actually just a floor. There were levels above that Jimi had never imagined. Jimi was operating on one of those levels. Jimi replayed moments from the performance in his mind. That sound during the third song that seemed to come from another dimension. The way Jimi had smiled during a particularly complex passage, as if the difficulty was irrelevant, as if he was just playing. The ease with which he'd transitioned between rhythm and lead, making the distinction seem arbitrary and outdated. What haunted Jimi most wasn't any single technique or moment. It was the totality of Jimi's approach, the fearlessness, the joy, the complete lack of concern about what was proper or correct. Jimi had spent years learning the right way to play guitar. Jimi had apparently never been told there was a right way, or had decided that information was irrelevant. Jimi couldn't play like Jimi. Nobody could, he suspected. Jimi's approach was too personal, too connected to who he was as a person and an artist. Trying to copy it would be pointless. But Jimi could use what he'd learned. He could stop being satisfied with technical proficiency and start exploring what else the guitar could be. He could take risks. He could experiment. He could stop thinking of the guitar as an instrument to be controlled and start thinking of it as a partner in creation. Over the following weeks, Jimi's playing changed. Colleagues noticed it in recording sessions. where he'd previously delivered exactly what was asked for, perfect, professional, reliable. He now sometimes suggested alternatives that were more adventurous, more experimental. When the Yardbirds recorded, Jimi pushed for sounds that weren't conventional. He started using feedback deliberately. He experimented with his guitar's volume and tone controls during performances rather than setting them once and leaving them. Some of these experiments worked, some didn't. But Jimi didn't care about the failures the way he once would have. The point wasn't perfection. The point was exploration. He saw Jimi perform several more times over the next few months. Each time he learned something new, not by copying Jimi's techniques, but by watching his approach, his willingness to fail in pursuit of a sound he heard in his head. They eventually met, briefly, backstage at a festival. Jimi shook Jimi's hand, told him the show was great. Jimi thanked him, mentioned he'd heard Jimi's session work, respected it. It was a brief professional interaction, but for Jimi, it represented something important. He wasn't trying to compete with Jimi. He wasn't measuring himself against Jimi's standard. He was on his own path now, one that Jimi had inspired, but that was uniquely Jimi's. When Jimi formed Led Zeppelin in 1968, the influence of that October 1966 night was clear. The experimental approach to guitar, the willingness to use the studio as an instrument, the conviction that the guitar could be more than just a rhythm or lead instrument, all of these came, at least in part, from watching Jimi Hendrix and realizing that the rules Jimi had learned were really just suggestions. Years later, after Jimi died in 1970, Jimi was asked about him in an interview. The journalist wanted to know if Jimi considered himself Jimi's rival, if he'd felt competitive pressure. Jimi thought carefully before answering. Jimi wasn't competition, he was education. The first time I saw him play, I realized I'd been learning the alphabet when there was poetry to be written. He didn't make me want to beat him, he made me want to be brave enough to find my own voice. The journalist pressed, "But you were already successful when you saw him. You were already one of London's best guitarists." Jimi smiled. "I was proficient. There's a difference between proficiency and artistry. Jimi showed me the difference. Before that night, I thought I was near the peak of what a guitarist could be. After that night, I understood I was just starting to climb." The education that began that October night in 1966 continued for the rest of Jimi's career. He never tried to play like Jimi. That would have been pointless, inauthentic. But he carried the lesson Jimi had taught without words, that mastery of technique is just the foundation, not the destination. That the real work begins when you stop trying to control the instrument and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. There was Jimi Page before Jimi Hendrix, confident, skilled, successful. And there was Jimi Page after Jimi Hendrix, humble, adventurous, willing to fail in pursuit of something greater than perfection. The transformation took 90 minutes in a small London club, but its effects lasted a lifetime. If this story about the moment confidence became education moved you, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Share it with someone who needs to understand that being good isn't the same as being complete. Have you ever witnessed something that completely changed how you understood your craft? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to turn on notifications for more untold stories about the moments that transformed music's greatest legends.